All right, so the last cultural difference we're going to look at is values. Now, values reflect what is considered meaningful or important in a culture. And we're going to begin by looking at Jackson's model regarding values in a culture. Now, Jackson's classic return potential model, I say classic, I'm talking 1960s, guys, reflects norms and values by showing the relationship between qualities or behaviors and the approval that you get in return within a culture, and showing this through correlational data. So in other words, if you display particular behaviors or qualities, what do you get back in return from your culture in the form of approval? And as you can imagine, these relationships can vary dramatically between cultures depending on norms, right? Different norms, different values, depending on both of these. So the relationships can be linear. When I say linear, you might remember, hopefully from our very first lecture, that correlational relationships can be positive or negative, right? So it can be positive or negative, okay? Meaning that the more that you display that quality or behavior, the more approval you get for a positive relationship, or the less approval for a negative relationship, right? But these relationships can be nonlinear. Okay, the more moderate the quality or behaviors displayed, more moderately, the more the approval, or the less if it's inverse shaped. So what is that shape called? What is that shape called, right? If the more moderate the quality or behavior is displayed, the more the approval. If you are saying to yourself, bell-shaped, right, you are correct. So that's a bell-shaped curve, and that can be inverse, right, also. So the more moderate the behavior that is displayed, the lower, the less the approval. All right, so now we're ready to look at an example of how Jackson's model was used to measure the approval return potential for three of these behaviors, qualities in U.S. culture. Okay, so we're starting here with integrity. See this line right here, integrity. Okay, see the strong positive relationship. The more integrity displayed, the more approval returned. That makes sense, right? Now let's look at this really interesting one of humor. Okay, this is sense of humor. A sense of humor is valued in United States society, but we can see that this is a nonlinear relationship, right? It is a bell-curved relationship. In plain English, it signifies that approval returns are highest when people display a moderate sense of humor. Okay, and if you think about that, that makes sense. Too little of a sense of humor causes one to be perceived as a stick in the mud or no fun, right? And too much of a sense of humor really can compromise their perceived ability to take things seriously. Now, these are two interesting values. Now let's look at infidelity, okay? Notice that this is a negative relationship. So it is linear, but a negative relationship. So the more infidelity in which one engages, clearly, the less approval that is returned. That's a negative relationship. However, what I want you to notice about this in particular, okay, is that it starts at the more neutral point of this disapproval approval axis. So it starts here at the more neutral point because fidelity is expected of people in general. This implies that fidelity is viewed as more of a norm than a value in U.S. culture. So Jackson's return potential model can be used to look at values like humor and integrity, and also to identify norms. So remember, values refer to what is important and meaningful to us. So think about this. Which is more important to you, freedom or justice? I want you to pause the video for a moment and decide freedom or justice, and then click it back on. Pause now. So research has found that people who choose freedom over justice tend to be more prejudiced toward other groups. Why? Because freedom tends to be viewed as a personal benefit, and justice as one that is more for everyone. If you chose freedom over justice, you may be thinking, but not everyone who chooses freedom over justice is prejudiced. And you're right. And that is why it's really important to study why people and groups value things differently, how and why. And this is called means and chains, studying means and chains. Studying of these mean end chains can help prevent everything from bar brawls to family feuds to wars, international wars. Now, there's a really classic metaphor that involves two sisters who quarreled over an orange. Finally, they compromised and they each took half. One squeezed juice from her half to drink, and the other used the peel of her half to make a cake. I mean, if they had just taken the time to learn their respective means and chains, how they each valued an orange, and their different associated goals, they could have both walked out with twice as much and a much better relationship to boot, right? Now, values can change over time and from person to person, but core values, not so much. Core values are relatively pervasive and enduring values across the culture. Geert Hofstad, this is your next researcher's name to learn, identified 6 dimensions or categories of core values in cultures, and each of these contain many core values or traits. So let's look at these 6 dimensions or categories. The first one is labeled here power distance. Power distance is the extent to which the less powerful are accepting of significant power discrepancies. So power distance, how much power differs between people. Okay. Now, in French society, for example, that's a society with high power distance. Scandinavians, on the other hand, are quite low. Individualism reflects the degree to which people view themselves primarily as individuals or group members. Individualistic cultures like the US are high in individualism, and then collectivists like Japan are low. Sexism is the extent to which men are expected to be competitive and ambitious, and women nurturing and concerned primarily with child and family. Japan is high, Spain is low. Uncertainty avoidance is the extent to which people think in absolute black and white and are uncomfortable with ambiguity. Greece is high, conversely, India scores low. So you might say that Indians tend to see 50 shades of gray in between. Long-term orientation, sometimes referred to as just LTO, represents a culture search for virtue above truth. Virtue above truth. But look closely at how virtue is defined. A country with high LTO focuses on persistence, for instance, rather than quick results, is thrifty rather than spending a lot, orders relationships by status, and so on. Taiwan is high, as an example. Portugal is low. Now, indulgence versus restraint is an interesting one. The extent to which a culture encourages indulgence or regulation of needs and wants. Okay, indulgence versus restraint. So clearly, differences in core values can explain why some marketing efforts succeed in one culture and fail in another. You know, North American consumers are more drawn to ads, for instance, that focus on individualistic core values, things like independence, self-reliance, self-achievement, right? In contrast, South Korean consumers react more positively to ads that emphasize collectivist core values, such as family integrity and group harmony. So, what does consumer psychology have to do with it? Because values can help us predict consumers' attitudes and behaviors, researchers have begun to develop and use value surveys. And that's what we're going to conclude with in our last segment.